Some of you may remember that last week's call to worship mentioned the story of Joseph that comes to us in the Old Testament. Today I want to read from his story again. Joseph's story is almost like a novel in the sense that it is a full story in the Bible and tells us from the beginning of his life until everything changed towards the end. And so this is Genesis chapter 45, verses 1 through 15 from the Common English Bible translation. Joseph could no longer control himself in front of all his attendants. So he declared, "Everyone, leave now!" So no one stayed with him when he revealed his identity to his brothers. He wept so loudly that the Egyptians and Pharaoh's household heard him. Joseph said to his brothers, "I'm Joseph. Is my father really still alive?" His brothers couldn't respond because they were terrified before him. Joseph said to his brothers, "Come closer to me." And they moved closer. He said, "I'm your brother Joseph, the one you sold to Egypt. Now, don't be upset, and don't be angry with yourselves that you sold me here. Actually, God sent me before you to save lives. We've already had 2 years of famine in the land, and there are 5 years left without planting or harvesting. God sent me before you to make sure you'd survive and to rescue your lives in this amazing way. You didn't send me here. It was God who made me a father to Pharaoh, master of his entire household and ruler of the whole land of Egypt. Hurry, go back to your father. Tell him this is what your son Joseph says. God has made me master of all Egypt. Come down to me. Don't delay. You may live in the land of Goshen, so you will be near me, your children, your grandchildren, your flocks, your herds, and everyone with you. I will support you there, so you, your household, and everyone with you won't starve, since the famine will still last 5 years. You and my brother Benjamin have seen with your own eyes that I'm speaking to you. Tell my father about my power in Egypt and about everything you've seen. Hurry and bring my father down here." He threw his arms around his brother Benjamin's neck, and wept. And Benjamin wept on his shoulder. He kissed all of his brothers and wept, embracing them. After that, his brothers were finally able to talk to him. There is a very old saying, charity begins at home. How many people have heard that saying? Charity begins at home. Yes. Can you tell me where it is in the Bible? It's not in the Bible. Some people think it's in the Bible, but it is not. Historians tell us that it came from the playwright Terence, the Roman playwright. He was a comic playwright, so he wrote plays with happy endings. And he lived around 150 to 100, almost 200 years before Christ, before Jesus. Charity begins at home. And I need to talk about that word, charity. In the history of the Christian church, charity was a translation of a Greek word, because you know, our New Testament was originally written in the Greek language 2,000 years ago. So charity was a way to translate the Greek word agape, which is a word for the kind of love that Jesus taught and Jesus lived. Agape love is a decision, not a feeling. It is a decision to give yourself to caring for others without expecting anything back from them. That is agape love. But in the everyday world, especially in these days, the meaning of that word charity has changed. And charity now means giving money to people who have needs, to people who are in need. Or it means an organization that is set up to provide money or help to people who are in need or in trouble. So, in common English today, charity is a word about money and being generous. But it has also become a word that for some, at least in the West, the western part of the world, a little bit negative, because it reminds them of the trouble that comes into relationships when money is involved. And so often people will say, don't just give money, teach someone to get a job. You know, don't fish for somebody, teach them to fish. So there are some slightly negative meanings to that word today. But almost 200 years ago, Charles Dickens, one of the most popular British writers of the 19th century, added to that saying, charity begins at home. And he said, charity begins at home and justice begins next door. Now, this was satire. This was sarcasm. He was making a joke. He was making fun of the way people too often think. And in this way, other people should be kind and generous to me. Charity begins in my home. But if there's something wrong, then they should check on my neighbor. That's what he means about justice. Not justice for me, but charity for me. Another way of saying this might be, if something good is coming, please knock on my door. But if something bad is coming, next door would be better. He was making fun of that thinking because it is too easy to think that way. I should be treated with grace. Other people should be punished. But there is another kind of trouble that comes from the idea of charity, and this is the person who helps everyone but not their own family. Have you ever known someone like that? Someone who wants to help, but somehow they never help their own at home. They seem so nice and kind and thoughtful when they are out in public, and yet they are unkind when they are in their own home with their own people. Or perhaps not unkind, they just don't pay attention. They just neglect their own. And I have known people like this, people who were always impolite and short-tempered with those who were closest to them, but always very nice and polite with other people. This is an example of what the Bible calls a hypocrite. A hypocrite is an old word for actor And the ancient actors used to hold a mask in front of their face. So a hypocrite is someone who puts on a different self when they go out the door. They pretend to be somebody that they are not. What good is kindness if you only practice it with strangers and are terrible to your own family and your own neighbors? How real a person can you be if you always pretend to be someone else when you step outside of your home? How real a person are you if you smile at your family or neighbors, but you take revenge on them in secret when they're not looking? Another great writer of the 19th century, this was an American writer, Mark Twain, was also known for satire and making fun of the way we think sometimes and behave. He wrote a story that I found very affecting. It affected me. It was making fun of a rich man. This rich man supposedly lived middle to late 19th century and owned many coal mines. So he had a lot of money and a lot of wealth. And he went to church, of course, because in the West, in his country, if you wanted to make good business contacts, then you needed to go to church. And he went to church and he would pray to God for the missionary cause. He would pray for missionaries. But this man had a cousin. She was a widow and she had no income and she was hungry. And she wrote him a letter saying, please, if you can help me at all, I really need help. And he sent her only $2. Now, that reminds me of a story that Jesus told. Many of you may remember the story of the rich man and Lazarus that Jesus told. The rich man was always having parties and dinners for his friends and celebrations. And all the time, right at the front gate of his property was a poor man, Lazarus, who was so poor and so sick that all he could do was sit there and hope for some kind of help. Lazarus was so bad off, as Jesus said. His life was so hard that the dogs came and licked his sores. So in the story that Jesus told, compared to the one about the man who owned the coal mines and sent $2 to his cousin, in the story that Jesus told, the rich man never gave $1 or a baht or a salung to Lazarus. Not even a crumb. Lazarus would have eaten the crumbs from the rich man's table. But the story, as Jesus told it, just says he died. He died, and he went to be with Abraham, Father Abraham. And that's like going to heaven. And the rich man went to Hades, or as we might call it, hell, where he was tormented and in pain and suffering. Only then did the rich man find out that his rich friends were not the people that God had wanted him to notice. The most important person in the rich man's life was the one he never even noticed, the one he never saw, the poor man at his gate. Is that what charity begins at home means? That if you don't take care of who is right in front of you, then how can you even understand what it means to love others the way Jesus asks us to. Is that what charity begins at home means? Unfortunately, there are people, at least in the West, maybe this part of the world too, who have used that saying, charity begins at home. It's almost as if they've added to the saying, charity begins and ends at home. So don't ever help anybody else. It needs to stay right here. The generosity needs to stay in this house with us. One man said his wife had used that quote over and over in their life together to block him from ever helping anyone else. But you know, the Bible, both in the Old and the New Testaments, speaks very harshly about forgetting to help the stranger or forgetting to help the foreigner. There is one scripture verse that some people might pull out and say, well, this one says something different. And you can find it in the first letter to Timothy in the 5th chapter, where it says, whoever does not provide for relatives, especially family members, has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. But it doesn't say care only for your family and no one else. So, this is why I thought of this saying when I was studying the story of Joseph and his brothers in the book of Genesis, the very first book of the Bible. Do you remember the story of Joseph? Some of you may never have read it. But Joseph was the 11th son of Jacob. And Jacob was one of the earliest fathers of the people whose story is told in the Bible. So this story goes way back to the very beginnings of the Bible, when its story began to be written. Joseph was the 11th son number 11 of his father Jacob, but he was the first son of Jacob's favorite wife, Rachel. And he was spoiled by his father. I guess the Thai people might say he was treated like kunnu. This was really makes us question the ancient fathers. They did not always do the right thing for their children. He was spoiled by his father, and his father at one time gave him a gift, a present, that he didn't give any of the other older boys, the 10 other sons. He gave him what many might remember as a coat of many colors. Now, today, Bible translators say that that is probably not what it was. The translation wasn't quite right. Instead, they suggest that Jacob gave his son a coat with sleeves. Now, in those days, a coat with sleeves, a jacket that had sleeves on it, was only for the people who were wealthy and noble, important people. It was a sign that you did not have to work with your hands, because anybody who had to do farm work or digging work or any kind of hard work with their hands couldn't have sleeves. So it was as if the father told his 10 older sons, this son is the one who is important, and I don't expect him to have to do any work. And the older brothers were so angry. And why wouldn't they be? They were so angry that they started to talk about how they wanted to kill their brother. They are sick of this. And not only that, he was obnoxious. He was always telling them how someday you're going to bow down to me. Oh, my goodness. But there were two brothers, the oldest among them, Reuben and Judah. And they actually talked the rest out of killing their brother Joseph. And they sold him as a slave instead. Was that really better? Well, you have to read the whole story and find out that in the end, Joseph did believe that it was better. And those people who told that story over and over saw that God made something wonderful out of that terrible thing that was done. And so the passage that we just heard today takes place when Joseph has somehow been pulled up out of slavery. It's a very interesting story. You really should read the whole thing. He's been pulled up out of slavery, and he has become the most important person in the whole government of Egypt, under the king, under the Pharaoh. He has become the number one advisor to the king of Egypt. And there is a famine. There are no crops growing in that whole area. But Joseph has come up with a plan, and the people have stored extra grain for many years. So they were ready when there came some years when there was no rain. They were ready. They had extra food. And there was a whole program of sharing it with the people. But this famine spread so far, it even went into the land where Joseph's family was still living, the land of Canaan, the land of Abraham. So the brothers have traveled because they've heard that in Egypt there's food. Maybe we can trade for it. Maybe we can get some and take it back. So this looked like the perfect opportunity for Joseph to punish his brothers after what they had done to him so many years ago. This was a chance to take revenge. Because Joseph knew that they were his brothers, and they had no idea who he was. They didn't recognize him. And he did play a couple of tricks on them, so he didn't come to the right place right away. But he could have strung them up by their thumbs. He could have had them tortured. He could have had their heads chopped off. He could have really destroyed them to get back for the huge crime that they had done against him so long before. But Joseph did not do that. He forgave them. No wonder the earthly father of Jesus was named Joseph. No wonder in so many parts of the world, Christians choose the name Joseph. It tells of two men who really had hearts for God, finally, in the Bible. Joseph, the slave who forgave. So, charity begins at home would mean something completely different if we look at the story of Joseph. Why did he forgive his brothers? And how many of us could really do that? Joseph really didn't behave very well as a child and a young man. He was really annoying, so it was partly his father's fault, partly his own fault. But in the end, his brothers actually had to bow down to him. Just like he'd said when he was a kid, someday you're going to have to bow down to me. Oh my goodness. That's exactly what happened. Some people would do anything to avoid that. Imagine when they found out who they were bowing down to. And then, of course, they were terrified because they thought his heart was like theirs. Well, we wanted to kill you, so I suppose you want to kill us. But there was forgiveness. He forgave them. He chose to help them. And it went beyond forgiveness because it went to reconciliation. Now, that word means when relationships are made whole again, when they are healed. Reconciliation. You know, you can forgive somebody for what they've done to you, but they might not accept that. They might still resent you. You might not be able to build that relationship back. Or that person might not be safe for you to be around, and you may need to keep some distance. That also happens in our lives. But it is God's great gift and a miracle of the heart when both parties involved, both sides of a broken relationship, can actually be healed. So not just forgiveness, but healing. And maybe even a better relationship. Because both sides have to say, oh, I see where I was mistaken here. I see where I was wrong. I see where I'm not perfect. They say that you never stop loving your own flesh and blood, no matter how great you become in the larger world. I don't know if that's always true, but I think you never stop wanting to love those who are your family. And sometimes people's hearts are broken because someone dies in their family and they never made things right together before that person died. I used to work in a hospital many years ago as a minister, a chaplain in the hospital. And so I was often with families when someone died. And I found that the people who were the most upset and who cried the most when someone died were people who did not have a good relationship before that death. So what they were weeping over, what they were crying over, was something that they should have had and never had. But Joseph shows us in one of the oldest stories that we have, Joseph shows us that the way to treat other people is not based on how they treat you, but it is based on the love and the kindness of God. Or as we say, this word agape, the love that is a decision and not a feeling, a love that decides to do what you can for the best for someone else and not expect payment. It's not easy. It is only through God's grace and the strength of the Holy Spirit that we can do that at all. And you know what happened in this story? Joseph's father was still alive, and they did bring him, and he was able to see his father again. And the family was fed because of the program that was happening in Egypt. Charity may begin at home. What happens when it doesn't just stop at home, but goes out into the world?